Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J. I am your history professor, and in today's lesson we're going to be looking at a period of time generally known as Late Antiquity, which refers to the end of the 3rd through the 7th centuries CE. We'll examine how the Emperor Diocletian tried to make the Roman Empire more manageable by splitting it into multiple parts, but then how a later emperor, Constantine, fought a series of civil wars to reunite all of Rome under his own control, and how he built a new capital city for the empire, Constantinople, or the City of Constantine. We'll also explore the end of the Western Roman Empire with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, but how the Eastern Empire continued on, but became more and more associated with Greek culture, Greek language, and Greek Orthodox Christianity, rather than Latin language and culture and Catholicism. We'll also study the role that Roman emperors played in the development of Christianity, including the Council of Nicaea called by Constantine to settle differences that had emerged in Christianity over matters of interpretation and practice of the faith. We'll also get into how the office of the Pope emerges and briefly look at an early powerful pope in Gregory I. Additionally, we'll take a look at monasticism and how Catholic monks set about converting Germanic tribes to Christianity, as well as how their actions and beliefs changed how the human body was viewed during these centuries. Finally, for this presentation, we'll take a look at the last of the 3 great monotheistic faiths, and that's Islam. We'll examine the context in which this faith emerges. We'll explore Muhammad and the visions he had, the 5 pillars of the faith, the conquests that Muhammad and his immediate followers engaged in to take over the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, and we'll end looking at the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims within the faith. Without further ado then, it is time for history, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello historians. Today we're going to discuss the end of the Roman Empire in the West, its continuation as the Byzantine Empire in the East, and the beginnings of medieval Europe. For my current students, as always, there's a forum in our course LMS that accompanies this presentation, so take a minute to access that forum now. For non-students watching this, welcome. I hope you enjoy the show and learn something about the end of Rome and the foundations of medieval Europe. My students have probably had enough time to access the forum by this point, so let's dive in. There's a lot to get to, so let's not waste any time and examine the end of the empire in the West and the creation of the Byzantine Empire in the East. Recall that in Unit 6's presentation, I discussed how after the last of the 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius, his son Commodus became emperor, but was assassinated 12 years into his reign. Recall also how after the end of the Severan dynasty in 235 CE, there was a period of anarchy in Rome, as 22 emperors held power during a 49-year span, with only 2 of them dying of natural causes. At the end of that period, in 284 CE, Diocletian became emperor and made reforms that, for a time, seemed to stabilize the empire. The first thing he did was split Rome into 2 halves, East and West. Each half was further divided into 2 prefectures, each with 3 dioceses and roughly 25 provinces. Each half was ruled by an Augustus and aided by a Caesar, which was like a vice-emperor who theoretically would become Augustus upon the former's death. Diocletian realized that Rome was simply too big to be ruled by one man from one city. Hence his implementation of the tetrarchy, or rule of 4, to make for more efficient and effective administration. Each Augustus would only be responsible for half of the empire, and a clear chain of command would, again in theory, allow for a smooth transition of power from one Augustus to the next. Also during Diocletian's rule, the army once again grew in size, as did the civil bureaucracy. These two alone soaked up nearly all of Rome's available funds, right at the moment the population was shrinking, thereby reducing the amount of tax money Rome was collecting to pay soldiers and civil servants. As a means of trying to avert economic catastrophe, Diocletian established maximum wages and prices for all industries across the empire. He also passed edicts forcing those serving as local officials in cities across the empire to stay in their posts and carry out Rome's orders. Recall that these officials did not get paid for their work, and it was feared, likely justifiably, that as the economy continued to suffer, those people would simply leave their posts for more financially lucrative pursuits. This would effectively leave Rome without officers at the lowest levels to implement imperial orders, which is quite obviously a bad thing. Diocletian also made those political positions hereditary, meaning a father serving as a city councilor was now forced to pass on that job and those responsibilities to his son, who was legally obligated to take up his father's post. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something unusual. He retired from office. Unfortunately for him, the Tetrarchy broke down rather quickly, as the Roman Empire, as extensive as it was, proved too small for the two Augusti and the two Caesars, just as the Republic had proven too small for Julius Caesar, Pompey, Octavian, and Mark Antony hundreds of years before. Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE, won a civil war against a rival for control of the western half of the empire, and took sole command of that half. 12 years later, in 324 CE, he won another civil war, this time becoming the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. During his reign, Constantine continued the process of expanding the army and imperial bureaucracy, which meant more expenses for the empire. To alleviate some of the financial woes Rome was experiencing, he introduced new gold and silver coinage, issued edicts forcing all Romans to stay in whatever profession they were currently in, and allowed latifundia to grow and convert the coloni from free farmers paying rent into non-free farmers tied to the land. One of the most important and long-lasting of Constantine's changes was the building of a new capital city for the empire. Rome's population was shrinking, the city was old, and Constantine wanted a new city in the east, closer to the richer, more urbanized half of his empire. He chose a site with a good defensive and trade position, the old Greek city of Byzantium. His new city would be called Constantinople, or City of Constantine, and would be the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire until it was finally taken by the Turks in 1453. This new city was on a peninsula that juts out into the Sea of Marmara. Its position on the Bosporus Strait also put it right at the center of trade routes between Europe and the Middle East, allowing Constantinople to thrive in trade and industry. This move to the east was significant, as it signaled that the imperial government was clearly privileging the eastern half of the empire more than the western half. This shift of attention coincided with other factors to bring down the empire in the west. It's time for the first review for today's lesson. First, the Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into two halves, each ruled by an emperor and a vice-emperor. He did this to try and provide more stable and effective rule for the Roman world. Second, Diocletian also established maximum prices and wages, and made political positions hereditary. Third, after winning 2 civil wars, Constantine became the sole ruler of Rome. He minted new gold and silver coins and built a fabulous capital city, Constantinople, on the site of the old Greek city, Byzantium. This signaled Rome was turning more towards its eastern half than its western. From the 3rd century on, Romans were coming into more frequent contact with various Germanic groups that lived on the other side of the Rhine and Danube rivers, the northern boundaries of the empire on the continent. Near the end of the 4th century, pressure from the migrating Huns from Central Asia forced some German tribes to cross the border into Rome. Some groups sought permission and aid from various Roman emperors, while others simply came over. Mistreatment by the Romans at times caused revolts by these groups, leading to outright war the Romans usually fared poorly in. In 408 CE, Alaric, leader of a tribe of Germans known as the Visigoths, sacked Rome. This was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been sacked, and the first time in its history that it was occupied by a foreign force. As more Germanic groups moved into Roman territory, in modern-day France and Spain, Roman officials and armies were pulled away from the provinces, essentially leaving them to their own fates. In 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, who wasn't recognized officially by the Eastern Emperor Zeno, was deposed, an event which some historians mark as the official end of the Roman Empire in the West. Although the West may have fallen, the eastern half of the empire continued on, and would do so for nearly 1,000 more years. The most important of these eastern emperors for our purposes was Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565. During his reign, he managed to recapture some of the old Western Empire, particularly Italy, from the Germans, but much of his gains were lost after his death. A more long-lasting legacy was the codification of Roman law into 4 volumes, making up the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of Roman law. These huge volumes contained Justinian's imperial edicts, a sort of training manual on the principles of Roman law, as well as a collection of imperial orders going back to the empire's beginning. This compilation of Roman laws would serve as the basis of law not only in the eastern half of the empire, but since it was written in Latin, it would be the foundation for European laws during and after the Middle Ages. By the 7th century, though, plague, overextension, and attacks from the Persians and Slavs had reduced the size of the Eastern Roman Empire to the city of Constantinople, some immediate surrounding territory, and land in modern-day Turkey. By the 8th century, the transformation of the Eastern Roman Empire into a separate political entity, the Byzantine Empire, one based on Greek language and culture, was complete. This new empire was strongly Christian, and religion would play an important role in its political development. For instance, the issue of religious icons was a hotly debated one. Some people did not have a problem with religious objects bearing the images of important figures in the Christian faith, while others, known as iconoclasts or smashers of images, disagreed. These religious disputes took on a serious nature as Byzantine emperors sought to use the issue to build up the authority of the head of the Christian church in the East, the Patriarch of Constantinople, against that of the popes in Rome. This will be one of many issues that will cause the split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Before moving on to the next topic for this lesson, let's pause here and review. First, in the 5th century, Rome experienced fatal problems, including the sack of the city of Rome by Alaric. These problems culminated in the deposition of the last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE. Second, the Eastern Roman Empire continued on, and under Justinian tried to recapture much of the former western half. Justinian also codified centuries of Roman law together in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Finally, the Eastern Roman Empire began to change in the 7th century, centering more on Greek language, Greek culture, and the Greek Orthodox version of Christianity than on Latin and Catholicism. Let's move on to religion, and begin this conversation by going back to Constantine. We've already seen his role in the political developments of this lesson, but he's also going to play a vital role in the religious developments as well. I referenced earlier that Constantine emerged victorious from a civil war to become sole ruler of the Western Empire. According to legend, right before that battle, Constantine saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign you will conquer," written across it. He then had all of his troops take some mud and make a Christian cross on their shields. After achieving victory, he gave credit to the Christian God for helping him in battle. The next year, 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christianity official toleration, meaning Christians were now free to practice their faith openly without fear of retribution or persecution from the Roman state. Not only that, the edict also reimbursed Christian groups for church and other property that had been confiscated from them by the Roman state. Near the end of the 4th century, the Emperor Theodosius I took the next step and made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, effectively making every other religion illegal. The church also began developing a more centralized, hierarchical structure, including archbishops that oversaw a number of bishops, who in turn oversaw a number of priests, monks, and nuns. Once Christianity was granted toleration by Constantine, the issue I discussed in Unit 6, the issue of many different Christianities, came to light. Recall that when the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 CE, it not only broke the center of Judaism, but it did the same for Christianity, which emerged from Judaism and was centered on Jerusalem for much of its initial development. Subsequently, many Christian communities were left to fend for themselves, and some developed ideas and practices that were different from others. Now those differences became important, as people began to argue that their version was the version everyone should follow. One of the biggest differences was over the question of Jesus' divinity. There were some Christian groups that argued Jesus was never truly divine, while others argued he was divine the entire time, while still others argued he was initially human, but then became divine through crucifixion and resurrection. A priest from Alexandria named Arius preached that Jesus was never divine, and his teaching then became known as Arianism. So serious were disagreements like these that Constantine decided to step in and solve the problem. In 325 CE, he summoned all the bishops across the Christian world to the Council of Nicaea to establish what Christians should believe. The council was attended by every bishop save one, Sylvester I, Bishop of Rome, for reasons to be discussed later. The council proceeded to not only produce the Nicene Creed, the proclamation of what every Christian should think about God and Jesus, but it also condemned Arianism as a heresy, meaning a teaching contrary to the official church teaching. They also debated and decided which texts had a place in the New Testament and which ones did not. The Council of Nicaea essentially established the Catholic or universal faith in church. Also, during this period of time, certain Christian thinkers emerged whose ideas proved quite influential in how the faith was practiced. One of these so-called church fathers was Augustine, who served as the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa in the second half of his lifetime. Augustine's most influential work, City of God, contrasts the temporal world of men with the heavenly world of God, arguing that although people should seek to secure their place in the city of God, here on earth, rulers and temporal authority were necessary to maintain peace and allow people the freedom to practice their faith and pursue salvation. He also believed that celibacy was the ideal for Christians. However, he also recognized that most people would not be able to resist the temptation, so marriage became an acceptable second option for the laity. For the clergy, though, celibacy was a must, for the officers of the church must be held to higher standards than regular Christians. We also see the transformation of the Bishop of Rome into the Pope. Sylvester I, the only bishop to not attend the Council of Nicaea, as previously mentioned, did not agree with Constantine that the emperor should also be the head of the church. He rested his case on the idea that he, as a spiritual descendant of the first Roman bishop, Peter, inherited the keys to heaven. Therefore, the Bishop of Rome should be the highest-ranking bishop and the one to call the shots within the church. Popes from the 4th century on began using the title Papa, which in English translates as father, and will evolve into the word Pope. Not everyone agreed, however. Some wondered why other bishops, such as the one in Jerusalem, could not also make a claim to lead the church. As we'll see in a moment, some bishops of Rome were powerful and assertive enough in their belief in their own spiritual power to establish the Roman bishop as the leader of the Catholic Church. Christian emperors, however, continued to play an active role in the church. The collapse of imperial institutions in the West opened the door for bishops to take more active roles in administration and governance, further blurring the line between church and state. Popes, meanwhile, began asserting their control over the Italian peninsula, beginning with the city of Rome itself, increasingly ignored after the capital was moved east. Pope Gregory I took administrative control over not just the city, but also a large chunk of territory surrounding Rome in central Italy. This island of church-controlled land became known as the Papal States. Gregory I also began asserting his control over the church in the West through getting involved in church disputes across Italy and beyond, corresponded with tribal leaders across Western Europe, and began sending missionaries to Germanic tribes and to England to begin conversions. That's a lot of religious development, so let's take a breather and review the material we just covered. First, Constantine claimed to have seen a Christian cross in the sky before an important battle, which led to him granting Christians throughout the empire official toleration. Second, after receiving toleration from the Roman Empire, the problem of different Christian groups having different beliefs from one another came to the forefront. Third, Constantine called an important meeting, the Council of Nicaea, to try and settle these differences. The Bishop of Rome, Sylvester I, was the only one missing, because he felt that he, as the spiritual descendant of St. Peter, was the one who should lead the church. Fourth, Pope Gregory I established the Papal States and began getting involved in disputes across Europe, enhancing the power of the Pope. The monastic movement also gained steam during the centuries we're exploring. A monk was a person who wanted to isolate themselves, to move away from cities and towns to live a life of seclusion. The idea was that after Christianity became the official religion of Rome, it was much easier to be Christian than it had been previously. There was no struggle against persecutions as some of the early Christian communities had to endure. Some began to believe that to truly show devotion to God, to really live for Him, one had to experience hardship. Thus, the first monks were solitary believers who wanted to struggle and rely on their faith in God to see them through. Over time, however, it became harder and harder to isolate oneself as more and more people became monks. Soon, groups of monks began living together in a relatively isolated area in a monastery. Benedict of Nursia, who lived in the early 6th century, created a set of rules which monks living together would obey, setting a pattern for how most other monasteries of the time would operate. The rules of Benedict called for obedience, poverty, and chastity. The monks were led by an abbot who was responsible for enforcing the laws. Following rules was not the only thing monks did. They spent regimented lives doing manual labor, reading, praying, and making copies of books, both religious and secular. Monasteries therefore became centers of learning during the European Middle Ages, with Irish monks especially keen on learning and teaching. Women who also sought to live a more godly life were called nuns, and they lived together in compounds called convents. Some convents were attached to monasteries, so there was some interaction between monks and nuns, while others were not attached. Convents offered women something they could not get anywhere else: an education. Even wealthy women at this time did not receive much formal education, so one strong attraction of the convent was the chance to learn much more than they could ever do outside of a convent. During the conversion of England and Germanic tribes on the continent, monks stumbled upon a couple of successful strategies for scoring converts. First, they found that once they converted the leader or king of the tribe, it was much easier to get more to convert, especially when the king in question ordered his followers to adopt Christianity. The second strategy involved adopting certain pagan practices into Christianity to make the different religions seem more similar, and thereby perhaps entice converts. One great example of this is the Christmas tree. Christian monks and other missionaries noticed that Germanic people had a habit of celebrating the tree spirits by offering gifts around the largest tree in the area, a practice that was then linked to the birth of Jesus and would evolve into the Christmas celebration. Lastly, monks and nuns took vows of absolute celibacy, and the monastic movement signifies for us a change in how the human body was viewed. In ancient Greece, games and festivals were often done in the nude, as the Greeks believed the human body was a thing of beauty that we should not be ashamed of. For the church in the emerging medieval period, however, the body was thought to be more sinful and a source of temptation that would distract from pursuing a spiritual existence. Hence, ideas of celibacy and virginity spread beyond the walls of monasteries. It's time for another review, so let's revisit the main points of this section. First, monks were those who sought to live an isolated life of hardship as a means of celebrating their faith in God. Second, groups of monks formed monasteries, where they spent their lives working, praying, and copying texts. Religious women spent their lives in convents. Third, monks devised two strategies to convert Germanic groups to Christianity: converting the king and adopting pagan practices. Finally, the monastic movement changed how the human body was viewed. Christianity is not the only religion to be discussed in this lesson. The late imperial, early medieval period also saw the emergence of the West's third monotheistic faith, Islam. We'll start by looking at the larger context of what was happening in the Arabian Peninsula, where Islam will be born. The climate here is not very favorable for farming, and only 1% of the land is arable or farmable, so people made a living as traders and merchants. Bedouin tribes regularly crisscrossed the peninsula, moving goods from the eastern trading zones of the Indian Ocean and the Iranian Plateau to the western trading zones around Egypt and the Mediterranean, and vice versa. Additionally, by the 7th century, the areas surrounding the peninsula were plagued by constant warfare, which threatened the caravan routes many Arabs relied on. Many believed that the Arab people needed to unite as one and combine their strength to defend themselves against the wars of others and the possible economic dislocation those wars could cause. But what exactly could unite all of the Arab people together? It's in this context that we meet Muhammad, a caravan manager and merchant in the city of Mecca. One day, while transporting goods, Muhammad had the first in a series of what he deemed divine revelations, messages from a golden book that was written directly by God. Initially transmitted orally, after Muhammad's death, these were written down and became the sacred book of Islam, the Quran. According to the Islamic faith, God created the universe and everything in it. People were subject to divine will. Additionally, Islam preaches that it's the next evolutionary step, if you will, of monotheism, and therefore related to both Judaism and Christianity. Islam believes that Moses and Jesus were both prophets bringing messages from God, and now Muhammad was the final prophet, picked to deliver the last of God's messages and complete the development of monotheism. Very few people in Mecca were amenable to Muhammad's teachings, and he was eventually kicked out of the city. He and a small group of followers then moved to the city of Medina, where they found a new home and a more receptive audience. It was here that Muhammad organized the first Muslim ummah, or community, one that was both political and religious, as there was no difference between the church and state. Islam has as its center the 5 pillars: belief in God and Muhammad as his prophet, daily prayer, giving to charity, fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and making a pilgrimage to Mecca if one had the time and the resources to do so. In addition, a set of laws regulating the behavior of Muslims known as Sharia emerged, including prohibitions on drinking, gambling, eating pork, and dishonesty. In 630 CE, Muhammad and his forces began a series of conquests, the likes of which the West had not seen for hundreds of years, perhaps not since the Persian expansion under Cyrus the Great. In that year, the city of Mecca was conquered and became the new capital of the Muslim world. Even today, Muslims face Mecca during their daily prayers. In 636, the Byzantines were defeated in battle. By 650, the Persians had been conquered. Muslim armies tore across North Africa and proceeded into Spain. Their advance into Western Europe was finally halted in 732 at the Battle of Poitiers at the hands of Charles Martel. A few years earlier, in 718, a Muslim assault on Constantinople was stopped by the Byzantines using Greek fire, preventing the Muslims from reaching Eastern Europe. Despite these two setbacks, the Muslims had absorbed Spain, North Africa, and the Persian Empire, in addition to the territory they already controlled on the Arabian Peninsula. When Muhammad died, he had no sons and left no plans for succession. His closest followers, therefore, gathered together and chose Abu Bakr, Muhammad's father-in-law, as the first caliph, or temporal leader of the Muslim community. As the Muslims expanded, they did not force anyone to convert to Islam, as the Quran clearly stated that conversion must be voluntary. They also showed respect to Jews and Christians in the conquered lands, giving them protected status because they were both people of the book, a recognition of the connection between the 3 religions. Although pagans were not forced to convert, Muslim leaders did come up with ways to entice them to do so. For example, levying higher taxes on non-Muslims and not letting them publicly express their faith, which prevented people from repairing temples or building new ones. In 661, Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, was assassinated and replaced as caliph by the founder of the Umayyad dynasty. This event would create a rift in the Muslim world that would exist to this day between the Shia and Sunni Muslims. Shia Muslims believe that power comes from the Ummah, or community, and only the community has the right to appoint leaders. The Shia, on the other hand, believe that only Ali and his descendants, as the nearest relatives to Muhammad had a right to lead the community. This initial difference would become calcified over the centuries, as more differences of opinion were layered on this initial disagreement. Today, most Muslims are Sunni, but a sizable minority, led by Iran, are Shia. Let's pause here and reflect on what we just learned about Islam. First, the Arabian Peninsula was surrounded by conflict, and many believed the Arab tribes should unite together. Second, Muhammad began having visions he believed were messages from God, messages in later years written down to become the Quran. Third, Islam centers on the 5 pillars of daily prayer, charity, traveling to Mecca if one can, fasting during Ramadan, and belief in God and Muhammad. Fourth, Muslim armies under Muhammad and his followers took control over the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, North Africa, and Spain. Lastly, the assassination of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, led to the split between Shia and Sunni Muslims that exists to this day. In later units, we'll see how Islam profoundly affected Western Europe. But for now, we're going to move on to investigate the fusion of German and Roman cultures between the 3rd and 7th centuries. We've already discussed the collapse of the empire in the West and the migrations of various Germanic tribes into Western Europe. Just because the political infrastructure of the Roman Empire fell does not mean that everything Roman simply disappeared at the snap of a finger, though. In the wake of the empire's demise in the West, we do see some Germanic groups adopting Roman traditions and practices, creating a blended culture that will evolve into medieval Europe. Let's look at Italy under the Ostrogoths first. In 493 CE, the Ostrogoths conquered Italy, and their leader, Theodoric, became king. He created 2 separate legal and administrative systems, one for the Germans based on Ostrogothic practices, and one for Italians based on Roman principles. He maintained the Roman administrative system for the peninsula and made it work alongside a different system for the Germans now living in Italy. This system would fall after the conquest of Italy by the Eastern Emperor Justinian, however, who would lose control of Italy to the Lombards, another Germanic group. Italy thus became a hodgepodge of Roman and Germanic peoples and practices. In Spain, the Visigoths also kept the Roman government structure in place. They, unlike many other Germanic groups, eased relations with the church in Spain by converting to Catholic Christianity. Other tribes adopted Arian Christianity, which automatically set them at odds with the church and many people in the areas they occupied. The Visigoths also allowed intermarriage between Germans and Romans, which is pretty much the ultimate form of cultural fusion. Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, was the home of the Franks. Clovis had conquered all of France and parts of Western Germany, creating a large kingdom. He also converted to Catholic Christianity to ease relations with the church, and was the father of the Merovingian dynasty, which would rule for 2 centuries. In Clovis's kingdom, secular officials called counts would administer territory alongside Catholic bishops, and upper-class Franks married into the old Roman senatorial class, creating a new nobility that was both Roman and German. The Franks were also an agricultural people, and the latifundia, which began during the Roman Republic, were maintained and expanded. Throughout Western Europe, Romans adopted Germanic weapons, while Germans copied Roman-style houses. German law, however, was different from Roman law in that it was more personal. Injuries inflicted on one person by another could, and did, often lead to vendettas and revenge by the families of the 2 parties. In order to tamp down on the violence and maintain order, Germanic groups utilized a fine system called Wehrgeld, or money for the man. According to this system, a different level of fines would be paid for crimes of different severity committed against members of the community. there was also a class element, as the code treated those of a higher rank differently than those of a lower rank. There was also a difference in the way Romans and Germans were treated, as exemplified by the best-known Germanic code, the Salic Law, created by the Salian Franks. There were also provisions regarding women in Germanic law codes, and the Salic Law is a bit reminiscent of the Code of Hammurabi we studied earlier this semester. The Germans used compurgation and the ordeal as parts of their jurisprudence. Compurgation was an oath of innocence sworn by someone accused of a crime, along with a number of witnesses attesting to the accused innocence. The ordeal, meanwhile, could take many forms, but usually involved some sort of painful physical trial an accused person could undergo to prove their innocence. The idea was that if someone was truly innocent, God would not allow them to be harmed, as they're not guilty of any wrongdoing. So if an accused person was able to grab a red-hot strip of iron with their bare hand and not get burned, they're obviously innocent. For Germanic families, the extended family of uncles, aunts, and grandparents was more important than the nuclear family. Males dominated the family, women were to obey their fathers and husbands, a situation not too different from the Roman Republic and the power of the paterfamilias. Fathers would arrange marriages of their children for the benefit of the larger family unit. Again, not unlike Roman practice during both the Republic and the Empire. Finally, female virginity and chastity were important to Germans, as they were the only way to ensure the legitimacy of children. This opened a door for the Church to make a connection between their religious practices and those of the Germans as a means of scoring converts. It's time for our last review of this lesson. First, the Ostrogoths of Italy under Theodoric kept some Roman traditions in place, and various wars in the regions made Italy an eclectic mix of Roman and German ideas. Second, in Spain, the Visigoths allowed intermarriage between Germans and Romans and converted to Catholicism. Third, in Gaul, Clovis also converted to Catholicism and used Catholic bishops alongside secular officers to manage his kingdom. Fourth, Germanic law was quite different from Roman law, relying on the ordeal and compurgation to establish guilt or innocence. Finally, Germans valued the extended family, male leadership, and female chastity and virginity. That does it for Unit 7. In this lesson, we've explored how the Roman Empire in the West fell and how the East carried on as the Byzantine Empire. We also explored the continuing growth of Christianity, as well as the emergence of the last of the three major monotheistic faiths, Islam. Finally, we investigated some examples of cultural fusion between Germans and Romans in the wake of the Western Empire's collapse. If you have any questions about today's lesson, please leave them in the comment section below or email me if you are a current student. If you'd like some more information on the topics discussed in today's lesson, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Finally, as always, no flame wars in the comment section. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again in the next video.